On the morning of Friday, December 5, 1952, 8 million Londoners woke up inside a cloud. Over the next 5 days, that cloud would quietly kill more people than the worst single night of the Blitz, and almost nobody realized it was happening until it was over. To understand how a fog can murder a city, you have to understand what London was in 1952. 7 years after the war, it was still a city of bomb sites and ration books, and above all, a city of coal. Coal heated nearly every home. Coal fired the power stations at Battersea, Bankside, and Fulham, right in the heart of town. Coal drove the steam locomotives pulling into its termini, the factories along the Thames, the gasworks. On a cold day, hundreds of thousands of chimneys exhaled smoke into the sky at once. And there was a cruel economic twist. Britain was broke, and its best, cleanest burning coal was being sold abroad to help pay the country's debts. What Londoners got to burn at home was the cheap residue, a low-grade, sulfur-heavy coal the trade called nutty slack. It burned dirty, it burned smoky, and in the first week of December 1952, everyone was burning as much of it as they could get. Because it was cold that week. Bitterly, unusually cold. And Londoners weren't worried. Fog was part of the city's identity. The Victorians had called them pea-soupers. Dickens had written them into his novels, Monet had crossed the Channel just to paint them. A thick fog was an inconvenience, a bit of atmosphere, almost a point of civic pride. Nobody looked at the grey sky on December 4th and saw a weapon. But something unusual was assembling over southern England. A large anticyclone, a slow, heavy dome of high pressure, drifted in and simply stopped, parking itself over the Thames Valley. Anticyclones bring still air and cold, clear nights, and that combination produced what meteorologists call a temperature inversion. Normally, air cools as you climb, so warm smoke rises and disperses. An inversion flips that, the lid of warmer air settles on top of cold, dense air at ground level. Nothing rises. Nothing escapes. And London sits in a shallow basin ringed by low hills, a basin that had just been fitted with a lid. On the night of December 4th, fog condensed in the cold, damp, windless air. Ordinarily it would have burned off by mid-morning. Instead, on Friday the 5th, the weak winter sun never broke through, and the smoke of a million coal fires had nowhere to go. Every hour, London pumped more soot into a bubble of air that was not moving. The fog didn't lift that day. It fed. The numbers behind that feeding are hard to picture. By later Met Office estimates, each day of the smog London's chimneys released roughly 1,000 tons of smoke particles and hundreds of tons of sulfur dioxide, and in the trapped, moisture-laden air, that sulfur dioxide was converted into an estimated 800 tons of sulfuric acid every single day. The city was slowly curing itself in its own smoke. By Friday evening, the fog had changed color. Witnesses described it turning yellow, then amber, then a greasy brownish black, as if the streets had been submerged in cold tea. It carried an acrid, sulfurous smell, burnt matches and coal tar, and you could taste it at the back of your throat. Inside that murk, chemistry was quietly at work, sulfur dioxide reacting inside fog droplets to form dilute sulfuric acid. Londoners weren't just walking through smoke. They were walking through an aerosol of acid, thickened with soot. By Saturday, December 6th, the city had effectively gone blind. Visibility in parts of London dropped to a few yards. By mid-afternoon, and on the worst days, by noon, the streetlights were burning, and it barely made a difference. In isolated pockets, most famously on the Isle of Dogs, hemmed in by the loop of the river, visibility was recorded as effectively nil. People there said they could not see their own feet. Think about that for a moment. Not the far side of the street. Not an outstretched hand. Their own. Shoes. The city's machinery seized up. Road transport crawled to a halt, and drivers simply abandoned their cars where they stood. The buses that kept running did so at walking pace, literally, because conductors and inspectors climbed down and walked ahead of them carrying lanterns and flaming torches, leading the vehicles through the murk like pilots guiding ships into harbour. River traffic on the Thames stopped. Flights were grounded or diverted. Mainline trains barely moved, and railwaymen laid detonators on the tracks, small charges that cracked like gunshots, because drivers could not see the signals through the gloom. Sporting fixtures were cancelled across the capital. Only the underground kept running properly, and it was mobbed. And there's a detail from those days that gets retold again and again, that blind Londoners, who navigated the city by memory and touch, guided sighted strangers home through the darkness. It's the kind of story that's difficult to verify case by case, but it was reported at the time, and it tells you exactly what the streets had become. Sunday the 7th was, by most accounts, the worst day of all. And still the fog did not move. It did not stay outside, either. The smog seeped into houses through window frames and under doors, and hung visibly in bedrooms and stairwells. It invaded public life in ways that sound invented but are documented. At Sadler's Wells Theatre, a performance of La Traviata had to be abandoned partway through, because the auditorium filled with haze and the audience couldn't stop coughing. Cinemas closed or emptied out because people in the back rows simply could not see the screen. A greasy black film settled on windowsills, on collars, on skin. People blew their noses and the handkerchief came away black. Then the animals started dying. That weekend, the Great Smithfield Show, Britain's premier livestock exhibition, was underway at Earl's Court. Prize cattle, some of the finest beasts in the country, began to wheeze, choke, and collapse in their stalls, tongues out, gasping. Several were dead or dying before the show was over, others had to be slaughtered on humane grounds. There's an oft-repeated story that quick-thinking farmers saved some of their animals by improvising masks from grain sacks soaked in whiskey. It was reported at the time, though the details have probably grown in the telling. The core fact, though, is grim and solid. The air of London had become lethal enough to kill cattle indoors. And a prize bull has far bigger lungs than an elderly man in a Bethnal Green bedsit. Because that is who was dying, quietly, at home and in hospital wards, in numbers nobody had yet added up. The very old, the very young, and anyone with weak lungs or a weak heart. Bronchitis sufferers drowning slowly in their own inflamed airways. Pneumonia taking hold in lungs scoured by acid droplets and soot. Ambulances, when they could move at all, crept through the streets led on foot by their own crews, and journeys that should have taken minutes took hours. Hospitals reported patients arriving with lips and faces tinged blue from lack of oxygen, admissions for respiratory cases multiplied several times over, and the wards overflowed into corridors. And still there was no panic, no sirens, no headline screaming catastrophe. People died in back bedrooms, one by one, all across the city, and the fog muffled everything, even sound. Survivors remembered the silence most of all, a city of 8 million people, nearly noiseless, wrapped in wet grey wool. The clearest evidence of what was really happening came not from the government, but from the trades of death. Undertakers began running out of coffins. Florists ran short of wreaths and funeral flowers. When the people who bury the dead cannot keep up with demand, you don't need official statistics to know that something has gone terribly wrong. There were darker stories too, reports of a spike in burglaries and smash-and-grab raids by thieves using the fog as cover, and later tales of people stumbling off wharves and towpaths into the Thames. Some of that is well attested, some of it lives in the blurry territory between record and legend, and honest historians flag it as such. What is not legend is the scale of the dying. On Tuesday, December 9th, the weather finally moved. A fresh wind pushed in from the west, the anticyclone slid away, and the Great Smog broke apart and drifted down the Thames estuary toward the sea. The sun came back. London wiped the soot from its windows and went back to work, and a great many people assumed they had simply lived through one more bad pea-souper. Then the registrars started counting. In the week of the smog and the days immediately after it, deaths in Greater London were running at roughly 3 to 4 times the normal rate. The initial reckoning was staggering. Around 4,000 people had died over and above what was expected, a toll comparable to the Great Cholera outbreaks of the previous century, compressed into a single week. And the dying didn't stop when the fog lifted. Mortality stayed elevated for weeks into 1953. The government of the day attributed much of that lingering toll to an influenza outbreak, a claim modern researchers treat with deep skepticism. When scientists re-examined the data in the early 2000s, they concluded that the true toll of the Great Smog was probably closer to 12,000 dead. That figure is an estimate, and it is still debated, but even the most conservative number makes those 5 days the deadliest air pollution event in European history. What happened next is almost as revealing as the disaster itself. At first, very little. Winston Churchill's government was reluctant to act. Coal was the economy, smoke was industry, cleaning it up would cost money Britain did not have. The housing minister, Harold Macmillan, argued in effect that governments could not be blamed for the weather, and one of the state's early gestures was to make cloth smog masks available through the National Health Service, a bandage on a severed artery. But a handful of stubborn backbenchers, among them the MP Norman Dodds, refused to let the body count be quietly buried, and the pressure forced an official inquiry, the Beaver Committee, chaired by the industrialist Sir Hugh Beaver. The committee's findings were damning, and they led to something genuinely historic. In 1956, Parliament passed the Clean Air Act, one of the first comprehensive air pollution laws anywhere in the world. It created smoke control areas where only smokeless fuels could be burned, paid households to convert their hearths, pushed power stations away from city centres, and forced factory chimneys higher. Change was slow. London suffered another killer smog in December 1962 that took hundreds more lives, but the trajectory bent. The pea-souper, that centuries-old character of London life, was legislated out of existence. Within a generation, the fogs of Dickens and Sherlock Holmes were simply gone. Today, the Great Smog is studied as the founding disaster of modern air quality law, the event that proved, with a mountain of death certificates, that polluted air is not a nuisance but a killer. Its data is still being mined by researchers, and its lesson has never stopped being current. The World Health Organization attributes millions of deaths to air pollution every single year, most of them just as invisible as London's were. No dramatic collapse in the street. Just weakened lungs, quiet bedrooms, and statistics. And maybe that is the eeriest part of the whole story. The Great Smog had no explosion, no earthquake, no wave. It was just weather and smoke and 5 quiet days, a disaster so gentle that a city of 8 million walked through the middle of it, coughing politely into handkerchiefs, and did not count its dead until it was over. If you want more forgotten history that sounds made up but isn't, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.